Soulstice, it's yet another in a sea of Soulslikes, right? Wrong. Don't let the name fool you. Soulstice is no Soulslike, but that's actually a good thing.
No. It's growing. There's something making it stronger. Something is behind this.
Soulstice feels like the original God of War, Devil May Cry, Berserk, and maybe Ikaruga had a baby, and that baby's fused with her sister's soul. And while it clearly wears its inspirations on its sleeves, this is no lazy copy and paste job. A challenging, rewarding, and unique experience that was one of the bigger surprises in a while, and worth checking out. But there are a handful of design decisions that hold the game back from greatness, and could be a deal breaker for some, and almost was for me. Released in 2022 for all current and last-gen platforms, excluding Switch, Soulstice was developed by Reply Game Studios, an Italian studio that focuses on AA games, with an emphasis on high production values, deep gameplay experiences, and engaging stories. They're most known for Theseus, which is a really solid VR game that I can almost guarantee you haven't played. So yeah, they're not really known at all. But it's clear they have passion for creating memorable experiences. Soulstice is far from perfect due to its terrible camera, lack of diverse environments, and a slow start. But it's still so earnestly inspired and creative that I still highly recommend you check it out. And here's why. The story begins at the end, with the world in ruins. A veil has opened above the city of Ilden, unleashing a horde of demon-like creatures called wraiths that ravage, destroy, and possess everything and everyone in their path. Chimera are beings with two souls fused together, and are the only ones strong enough to fight back against the onslaught. You play as Briar, a chimera who's been fused with her sister Lute to save humanity from the brink. Lute has sacrificed herself to create the chimera, turning herself into a shade, existing between two realms, not quite in this world and not quite in the other. It's this bond that gives the two strength and is the only hope against the demon horde. The inspirations from the popular manga series Berserk and Claymore are instantly apparent through the visual designs of Briar with her massive greatsword traipsing around a world of ruin. Though even with those clear connections to those other works, Soulstice creates its own identity. There's no other game that looks or feels quite like this. The lore and the characters are surprisingly deep, exploring complex themes about relationships and the tolls they can take. While there are tons of cutscenes between the action, they rarely overstay their welcome, helping to set up the world-impacting stakes. No one's Nathan Drake, spitting out one-liners for every situation. No, everything is played straight here, with almost no moments of levity throughout. But with the surprisingly solid voice acting and genuine connection between the two sisters, it never feels like the story needs a change of tone. I really like the dynamic between the two sisters. Lute appears frail and bound to her sister, while Briar seems stoic and tough. They both need each other. Their strengths and weaknesses are balanced in each other. Inside and outside of combat, their bond is unbreakable. None of this matters though if the gameplay doesn't hold up, and after a sluggish start, it absolutely does. Briar is a battle-hardened warrior who wields a big-ass greatsword and other
Extra big-ass
weapons, with a huge arsenal of combos that grow over the adventure. You'll navigate Briar and Lute through the 25 mostly linear chapters, seeking out hidden secrets, solving some simple puzzles, and kicking some complex ass. Most chapters are beefy, taking the better part of an hour, culminating in an epic boss fight. And others will have you playing alone as Lute, navigating the endless void and looking for a series of echoes from Briar's tortured past. I found these incredibly frustrating at first, feeling like I was just blindly searching in the dark. But then I realized I'm a freaking idiot. See how the ripples on the ground point you to the next echo? Yeah, well I see it now too, so no need to be so smug about it. Most levels are a straight line path, but exploring around every corner will reward you with some consumable items, upgrades that will permanently increase Briar's maximum health and loot's entropy, or maybe some breakable crates or crystals that shower you with shards that you can use for buying items or upgrading skills. The core gameplay hook is based on loot switching between the evocation and banishment fields, which are these red or blue bubbles that surround the sisters, letting them touch the untouchable. Loot can create a blue field with the left trigger or a red field with the right, and you can only interact with or damage things aligned with the corresponding field. Things start out simple enough, usually with just a single enemy or item type, but eventually you'll be swapping back and forth during platforming puzzles or in combat. It's important to remember, loot can only keep fields open for so long. If you exceed her limit, not only does the field go away, but so does loot for a limited time, which can be panic-inducing, especially in the heat of a fight, where not only can't she protect you, but you can't hit some enemies either. The various environmental obstacles and puzzles mostly boil down to using your fields in new ways, like aligning to the color of a platform so you can stand on it, then having you change alignment in the air to grab some crystals. New dangers are regularly introduced that can kill you in fresh and exciting ways, like crystals that explode if you're aligned to them for too long, or ones that hurt you if you aren't aligned to them. Once new types are introduced, they'll be layered into everything else out there to kill you. Speaking of which, there are void challenge rooms hidden in out-of-the-way places that have you defeating a room full of enemies within a time limit and under specific conditions, like taking out a certain enemy type first, not breaking any of the crates, or not falling off floating platforms. These can be a lot of fun, but amplify any frustrations you may already be feeling about the combat, with the additional limitations imposed on you. Though these are worth completing, not just for any trophy hunters, but also for the rewards like crystals. Now, if you ever get stuck on one of these, I recommend just moving on rather than continuing to bang your head against the wall. Over time, you'll gain more abilities that make these easier to get through, and since you can always revisit previous sections through the chapter select, you can return to them later to give it a go. Layton is the merchant who sells you items, gives you new weapons, upgrades your skills, and doles out bits of lore. All around, he's a pretty handy dude.
Thank you.
You'll buy everything with the red and blue crystals you've been furiously hoarding from your travels. Red crystals upgrade Briar's abilities, which are tied to each of her
Extra big ass
weapons, and cost an arm and a leg. Blue crystals upgrade loot skills, and while each one costs far fewer crystals than Briar's, she has a ton more to unlock, grouped into trees for offense, defense, fields, and chaos. What's cool about loot is you can respec her at Layton without a penalty. This lets you play around with different powers, particularly if you're stuck on a tough section, or just want to see what else she has on offer without always needing a plethora of crystals to do so. Okay, combat is the real draw, and what's likely to hook you in or push you away. You'll start with simple combos using light and heavy attacks, a dodge, and a sort of parry using loot. Over time, you'll gain additional weapons, combos, and abilities. You'll start with the Ashen Vindicator, a massive greatsword that transforms into an equally massive hammer called the Ashen Enforcer. Layton keeps a fairly regular drip of new weapons coming, each with a specific purpose, from armored fists, a bow, a pair of matching cannons, and more. Understanding each weapon and when to best use them is the key, like how the bow is best for peppering enemies at a distance, or daggers for getting up close and personal, but terrible in a crowd. And then you have my favorite, the whip. Not only does it look cool as hell, but is great for crowd control. The greatsword is always mapped to the triangle button, and all of the other weapons are mapped to the square. You can quickly swap between weapons, building beefy combos across various weapons. Nothing feels superfluous or redundant. They're balanced with strengths and weaknesses against all the enemies out to turn you into a fine paste. And there's a lot. New enemies are constantly thrown your way, forcing you to change up your tactics. Over time, you'll be ass-deep in wave after wave of bloodthirsty monstrosities, from big brutes sporting heavy armor or shields, requiring going through or around their defenses, to little twerps hanging back and throwing projectiles from a distance. Some fight in packs, overwhelming you with sheer numbers. And then there are enemies requiring either the evocation or banishment fields, and sometimes even both. So you'll be swapping between fields, timing your parries, dodging and attacking, all while trying not to overwhelm loot. And that's not to mention the giant bosses, each with unique patterns and gimmicks that are surprisingly tough at times, and a real highlight for sheer spectacle, but also that satisfaction you get when you finally lay waste to them. Loot isn't just going along for the ride. On top of using her to parry enemy attacks, she also does a lot on her own as you unlock more of her skills. She'll automatically attack enemies and even parry some attacks that you miss. Together, you become a force of nature, tearing through the ravenous horde. The way the two sisters work together is really rewarding, and the better you are at using various combos, parrying, and avoiding damage, the more unity you'll build, filling this gauge in the upper right. When it's full, you can unleash synergy attacks, a hard-hitting finisher that can be used at the end of a combo, or go berserk, temporarily removing the need for fields and letting you tear into anything left. While there's a lot to process here, when it clicks, it really clicks, making you feel like a powerful badass in full control. But it didn't click right away. I'd say it took some 5 to 6 hours before there was a good flow and I was really having fun. And yes, that's a tall order to say just push through the first third of the game, it eventually gets good. But after that, it really is worth it. I can't overstate just how great the combat gets. Eventually. Now, there are 3 main issues that make the beginning hours such a slog. First are the controls. It wasn't that they weren't responsive, far from it, but they weren't really intuitive. Over the years, we've standardized a lot of button mapping, so having things like the main attack mapped to the triangle and the heavy attack mapped to the square, well, it just felt wrong. Okay, not a big deal, I got over it pretty fast. It took much longer to get over the slow character progression though. You see, at the start, you have very few tools at your disposal. You only have 2 weapons and a couple of basic attacks that you use ad nauseum. And without a big toy box to play with, monotony sets in fast. However, as you level up Briar and Loot, unlock their skills, and gain new weapons, it feels like the shackles are removed. You're firing on all cylinders and it feels great. But what never feels great is the camera. The camera. I take back all of the complaints about bad cameras from other games. I think we found the world champion here. It's a little hard to fully grasp just looking at the footage, so let me see if I can explain. First off, the camera is mostly fixed, meaning you have no control, though it may track or follow you. And yes, while this was the style in, say, the older God of War games, it certainly feels limiting to play today. Though that can and has been overcome before. Even back on the PS2, through things like shadows to help communicate depth, smart camera placement to prevent getting stuck going back and forth between angles, or smart adjustments to the camera for fights. But those techniques really aren't used in Soulstice. In combat, you'll usually gain camera control, but even then, you'll find yourself missing hits because you can't make out the exact enemy position. In a fast action game like this, with everything going on, you need a camera that isn't fighting you as hard as the enemies. And when fights end, and the camera snaps back to fixed, I found myself disoriented as to the correct path forward. Now it's not like it's unplayable, but it absolutely impacts the experience. So here's the deal. Yes, these issues were real and had me rethinking whether I wanted to go the distance, but I'm so glad I did. Camera issues aside, the battle system is responsive, challenging in the best possible way, and a lot of fun when things get going. Chaining attacks, swapping between weapons, and using Loot's abilities feels epic, and totally worth those first few hours. Visually, I thought Soulstice was great. Fittingly epic vistas, decrepit ruins, and a bleak, almost hopeless look to everything. As you navigate through the environments, Briar is dwarfed by the scale of it all, revealing the swirling vortex above Ilden, both haunting and beautiful. And while there were some rougher textures when you get up close, the framing smartly minimizes that, making for a visually powerful experience. Most of the game takes place in the medieval cobblestone streets, buildings, and sewers of Ilden. There's a noticeable lack of environmental variety, with the exact same hallways used repeatedly. It gets confusing at times when you assume you've already been there before. There's this light cel-shaded look to the character designs, mixing anime with realism, looking quite distinct. Briar with her chunky armor, eye patch, and oversized sword looks fittingly stoic and ready for battle. Not sure what happened to her other pant leg though. Maybe she lost it in a fight? Lute looks just the opposite, wispy and almost fragile. The enemies are these gruesome, horrific creatures with a ton of variety, both in how they look, but also in their movements, making for highly dynamic fights. Similar to how the fights hit their stride in the second half, the variety of enemies thrown your way are part of that. The first half often feels like copy and pasted encounters, but like a night with your mom, the second half is balls to the walls mayhem in the best possible way. Both sisters are excellently voiced by the talented Stephanie Houston. Does that name sound familiar? Whether in Wanted Dead, a highly underrated action game, see my review if you're curious, or as Quiet in Metal Gear Solid 5, she's becoming a favorite of mine.
We might not have enough time. Soon it will be too strong to seal. There will be nothing to do.
We can't wait for reinforcements. We're on our own in there.
The music is awesome when it kicks in, with crunchy synths and chaotic drum and bass beats. It's not what you'd expect, but it's kinda perfect. I didn't have any issues running Soulstice on my PS5, with the exception of a single crash throughout dozens of hours. There were a few graphical modes on offer with the typical 30 frames a second resolution and 60 frames performance modes, as well as a balanced mode which lands in the middle as you'd expect. You do you, but I recommend performance or balance. If you try to play this in 30 FPS,
gonna have a bad time.
Soulstice isn't overly long, taking about 15 to 20 hours for a single playthrough. From there, you'll unlock additional difficulty modes and New Game Plus. There's actually 5 difficulty modes, with Human, Initiate, Knight, Chimera, and Transcended. And for me, this is where the game really shined, but also just the start for completionists. Being so limited in skills, weapons, and abilities in the first few hours of the initial playthrough felt, well, limiting. But it was exhilarating blasting through hordes of enemies that were a slog my first time, all beefed up with everything at my disposal going through the second time. The game was so much faster and more dynamic right away. Now, if you're looking to get the platinum, you'll need to plan for 4 full playthroughs. Yeah, each at progressively higher difficulties as they don't stack. You'll need to max out your abilities and get platinum rank on all the void challenges. Going for completion is definitely not for the faint of heart, and outside of a second run, I wouldn't recommend it for most players. To do everything, rocking that platinum badge of honor, expect 45 to 60 hours. Soulstice came out of nowhere for me, and it's fantastic with a few caveats. The slow progression and terrible camera need rework, but the combat is incredible once it's firing on all cylinders. The world building, lore, and characters were consistently interesting and unique. There's a lot of creativity and passion on display that punches above its weight. Despite its name, it's not chasing the Souls-like trend. It's not a live service game. There aren't any microtransactions, pay-to-win mechanics, or loot boxes. Soulstice is an awesome throwback to those classic action hack-and-slash games from the PS2 era, in the best possible way. It's a AA game clearly made by a team with passion, and for that reason, I recommend checking out Soulstice. It's the type of game that could benefit from a sequel, polishing the rough edges and building on the lore. Soulstice has the potential to start a new franchise, and I really hope Reply Game Studios gets the chance to do just that.
But while the mortal body must perish, that which is immortal is bound to be reborn.